On our panel today, we have Kate Rawson, she, her, as the LGBTQ Victim Services Specialist for the NC LGBTQ DV Response Initiative. Kate provides support as well as training and technical assistance to project partners across the state. Kate studied psychology at Appalachian State University and got her master's in Student Affairs Administration from UNCG. Prior to this role, Kate has worked in both victim advocacy and LGBTQ+ education and programming at UNCG. She's passionate about advancing equity and inclusion for queer and trans folk through an anti-violence and anti-racist framework. In her spare time, Kate likes to travel, eat good food, and explore the outdoors with her partner. E. Wright, they, them, and she, her. E serves as the LGBTQ Survivorship Services Coordinator with the LGBTQ Center of Durham under the Domestic Violence Response Initiative. E has over 5 years of anti-violence advocacy experience spread across rural and urban areas of NC. E has their Bachelor's of Science in Psychology and is a mental health qualified professional. E is loud about dismantling white supremacy, homophobia, anti-fat bias, disability discrimination, and other forms of oppression, especially amplified in the South. E identifies as queer, non-binary, neurodivergent, a proud Black cat parent, and a houseplant enthusiast. And finally, Stephen Fletcher, he, him. Growing up, Stephen always had a heart to help others. After obtaining his bachelor's in psychology from Mars Hill College, Stephen began working in behavioral healthcare. Stephen's natural drive paired with his passion to help others led him to partnering with a Charlotte, North Carolina-based organization that provided services to youth and adults in needs of support and advocacy. In 2000, Stephen opened and managed a site for this organization in Asheville, North Carolina for 4 years. In 2004, Stephen was the operations director for a medical company with locations throughout North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. In 2015, Stephen and his partner moved to Winston-Salem, North Carolina, where he continued working with youth who are part of the LGBTQ community and juvenile justice system. In 2020, Stephen joined Family Service of the Piedmont as the community outreach team coordinator. Stephen leads a team that provides domestic violence services, advocacy, and outreach for 4 specialty areas: elder abuse, human trafficking, sexual assault, and the LGBTQ+ community. I'm going to pass it on to the panelists.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kate Rawson. As Scott said, my pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I am honored to be kicking off our opening session this morning. So we're going to get started with a little bit of, let's see, let me make this full screen for myself. So this is a panel session, but to kind of start us off, we're going to do a brief intro to introduce what this entire symposium conference is about. So I'm going to do a little bit of LGBTQ and domestic violence 101 for the first part of this session. So here's what we're going to be talking about: some terminology and language that's going to be used today, or at least through this presentation, some prevalence of LGBTQ domestic violence, some unique experiences and barriers for LGBTQ survivors, and a brief overview of the grant initiative that's hosting this symposium. And then we'll shift into the panel of LGBTQ advocates that Scott introduced. If y'all have questions at any time, feel free to put them in the chat, and either myself or someone else will hopefully be able to answer them quickly. All right, so some key terminology when we're talking about intimate partner violence or domestic violence and LGBTQ or queer things. So intimate partner violence, which could also be interchanged with domestic violence or partner abuse, they all mean very similar things. So typically that is when one partner in an intimate relationship is enacting some type of abuse towards the other partner. That might be physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, financial abuse, etc. I'm sure throughout the next 2 days, we'll hear about other forms of abuse and violence that particularly queer and trans folks experience. So shifting to thinking about gender and sexual orientation terminology, I know folks are here today from all sorts of backgrounds, so we're going to have lots of experts here, and we also might have folks here who are brand new to this conversation, which is okay. We welcome all levels of knowledge. And so it's important to kind of differentiate between some of these terms we'll be using and making sure that everyone's on the same page. So when we say gender or gender identity, we're talking about how someone identifies their gender, right? Whether that be a man, a woman, somewhere in between, neither, right? We're not just talking about cisgender folks, but trans folks and non-binary folks as well. And that may or may not match the sex someone was assigned at birth. Versus sexual orientation, right? That is a different identity. That is who someone is attracted to or who they want to partner with, right? So this may be gay, straight, bisexual, queer, asexual, etc. So then we move into the acronym. So you might hear LGBTQ, you might hear LGBTQIAP. There are even longer versions. And so we don't have time to go over every letter and what they mean today. So if that is something you're looking for, want to learn more about all of those diverse identities, I encourage you to seek out that education either in your community or online. So for myself, I may use LGBTQ+ and queer and trans interchangeably. So the acronym, right, being pretty inclusive, but also the words queer and trans can both mean be umbrella terms for the community, right? So queer can really encompass anyone who doesn't identify as straight. It can also apply to gender in some cases as well. And trans being an umbrella term for anyone who is not cisgender. So cisgender, if you don't know, that means that your gender identity matches the sex you were assigned at birth. For myself, I am a cisgender woman because I was assigned female at birth and I identify as a woman. And I'm also queer, but that is a separate identity. Non-binary, that is anyone who does not identify within the strict gender binary of man or woman. So that can mean a lot of different things for a lot of different people. They might identify as a little bit of both of those genders or neither of those genders or somewhere in between outside of that spectrum. It can really encompass a lot of different gender identities. And lastly, pronouns. Pronouns are super important for everyone, right? So going back to, elementary school English, pronouns are the words you use to talk about someone in place of their name. So we're familiar with she and her and he and him, and even they and them. I know we grew up learning that they and them were for groups of people, that they were only plural, right? But a lot of people use that as their pronoun in the singular. Particularly folks who are trans or non-binary are going to be more likely to use those pronouns, or people may use sets of different pronouns like she or and they, he or they, all three. They may also use pronouns that are not listed here. And yeah, I encourage you to, if you're interested in learning more, you can go to mypronouns.org. That is a fantastic website. Okay, so moving forward. So thinking about these intersections, right? This is what we're talking about for the next 2 days is what are the experiences of domestic violence or intimate partner violence for the queer community? So just a few stats. So for almost 44% of lesbian women and 61% of bi women have experienced rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner at some point in their life, compared to about 35% of heterosexual women. And that was a national study done by the CDC a few years ago. Similarly, 26% of gay men and 37% of bi men, compared to 29% of heterosexual men, have experienced rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner. 54% of trans people have experienced some form of intimate partner violence, and 47% have experienced sexual assault. So oftentimes when we're talking about the queer community, two of the specific groups that experience violence at incredibly high rates and are often the most marginalized are trans folks and bisexual folks. Their numbers are often the highest when we're thinking about the queer community overall. And lastly, 77% of LGBTQ victims of intimate partner violence homicide were people of color, and 46% were transgender women of color. And that was in a 2016 report. So just wanted to highlight those intersectionalities and thinking about how for folks who hold multiple marginalized identities, so if they're, as an example, a person of color, and also queer or trans, they may be at an even higher rate of experiencing this type of violence. All right, so I know a lot of folks here potentially work in domestic violence agencies or college campuses doing this work. And so I'm sure you've seen some form of a power and control wheel through your position, but I wanted to, as we're talking about the experiences of LGBTQ victims and survivors, I wanted to show this is one of the examples of an LGBTQ power and control wheel. So as you can see, the entire wheel is outlined by these systems of oppression, right? So heterosexism or homophobia, biphobia, transphobia. I would also add racism, ableism, all the other isms to this. And so we're going to pull out a couple examples of what this might look like, what power and control might look like within queer communities. So as some examples to get you thinking, an abusive partner may threaten to out the victim or survivor. So if a victim or survivor is not out in all spaces in their life, maybe they're not out at work, maybe they're not out to their family, the abusive partner may say, well, if you leave me, I'm going to tell your boss that you're gay or that you're trans. And if that person is not ready to come out in that space, that's going to keep them in that relationship. The abusive partner may discourage them from going to LGBTQ spaces in a community, maybe to keep them from finding other support or meeting new people as a way to maintain that control, and potentially maybe keep themselves as the only supportive person in that victim's life. They may use kind of some emotional abuse or psychological manipulation and say things like, well, you're not queer enough or you're not trans enough. And if someone hears that enough, they might internalize those messages, which is going to, continue to potentially invalidate themselves, lower their self-worth, things like that. An abusive partner might use coercion or manipulation to force the survivor into certain sexual acts. So of course, this is something that could happen in any relationship, but if you put a queer spin on it, it might be someone saying like, well, you're not really a lesbian if you don't do this with me in bed. Or I thought bisexual people wanted to have threesomes, so we're going to do this. So really using that sexual identity or potentially that gender identity to coerce someone into doing something. And a last example, so particularly if a victim or survivor is transitioning, the abusive partner might withhold access to hormone injections or maybe keep them from getting to a doctor's appointment where they get their shots, or hide other transition-related care that's in the house as a way to maintain that power and control in the relationship and keep the victim or survivor from doing what they would like to do. All right, so we're going to talk about a few barriers to reporting and/or help seeking for LGBTQ victims and survivors. So, and of course, all the ones you'll see today are definitely not all of them. So I want to remind you, as I mentioned before, that all of these things are rooted in these systems of oppression, right? So heterosexism, transphobia, or cissexism, which is another way to frame that, racism, ableism, et cetera. All of those things create and amplify these barriers. So one might be the fear of being outed. So I kind of mentioned that before. If someone's not out in all spaces, they might not want to report violence that's happened to them for fear of what information might get out to other people they know. The internal belief that domestic violence doesn't exist in queer relationships, right? So when we think about domestic violence in our society, in our culture, we still often have that image of a cis man abusing a cis woman, right? And so we don't see or we don't hear about domestic violence or intimate partner violence talked about through a queer lens, or what does that even look like? And so a lot of queer victims and survivors they might not be able to recognize what's happening to them, or they might believe like, oh, that's a straight thing, like that wouldn't happen in our relationship. And that's going to keep someone from seeking help or ever leaving that relationship. So small overlapping communities. So think about potentially in a rural area or maybe the queer community is really small, and everyone knows everyone, that sort of environment may keep a survivor from coming forward because they don't want everyone to know, or they don't want to mess up potentially a friend group dynamic. Yeah, there's lots of things that may be showing up there. So police violence, it's not a surprise that the queer and trans community has a history of police violence, and particularly, thinking about queer and trans communities of color, that is still incredibly prevalent today. And so there's a lack of the queer cultural competency training in law enforcement as well. And so there's been studies and, reports in the past few years that because of this, if someone does decide to call the police and, say there's a couple living in a home and it's 2 women or 2 men or 2 trans folks, and the police show up and they're so used to like looking for the man or the masculine person as the abuser and try to arrest that person, and they show up and their script is flipped. They don't know who to arrest or what to do. It's common that police will arrest the wrong person, or they will arrest both people in the relationship because they can't identify the primary aggressor. And so because of that, there's this mistrust of service providers and law enforcement, just systems in general. Queer folks don't utilize the legal system as often compared to cisgender and straight victims. And even formal domestic violence agencies, even if they have the best intentions, they might not always be prepared to meet LGBTQ needs. And so for that LGBTQ person, a formal domestic violence agency might not feel safe or affirming right off the bat. Gender exclusive spaces, when we think about domestic violence shelters, there are still ones today that might be called women's shelters. Or even if they're not called that, that's how people think about domestic violence shelters. And so, what does a non-binary person do, or what does a trans man or a trans woman do if they are not sure if they're gonna have a space there to be safe? And a final example is that protective orders were not granted to same-sex dating partners until this year in North Carolina. So we were the last state of all 50 states to kind of overturn this problem. So same-sex married partners could get protective orders, but if you were not married, there were all these stipulations, and it was really difficult, especially for younger people, to get a protective order from an abusive partner if they needed it. So these are just some of the reasons why our initiative exists. So I'm going to tell you all just for a couple minutes about the North Carolina LGBTQ Domestic Violence Response Initiative before we turn it over to the panel. So we are entering our 5th year of funding, which is really exciting. And funding for this project, we want to thank the Governor's Crime Commission of the state. They're the primary funder of our project. So what we do, our goals are basically to identify, implement, and evaluate best practices for advancing the capacity of communities and organizations to provide safe, affirming, and effective services to LGBTQ survivors. And as April mentioned earlier today, we have a partnership with 3 domestic violence agencies, 1 LGBTQ center and 1 campus-based violence response center. And we're trying to advance a community-informed and intersectional framework for how communities and organizations across North Carolina and beyond can provide safe, affirming, and effective services to LGBTQ survivors. So these are our partners. We have Helpmate in Asheville, North Carolina. Huge thanks to them for being kind of one of the hosts of this project and helping us get everything together for the symposium. They played a vital role in getting the symposium together the past few months. We have at UNCG, the Campus Violence Response Center. We have Family Service of the Piedmont, which is also in Greensboro, the LGBTQ Center of Durham, and Outer Banks Hotline in Manteo. So huge shout out to our current 5 partners on this project. So just briefly, I want to share our impacts from the past 4+ years. So through our partners, we have served over 1,200 LGBTQ survivors since 2018. And through serving those people, we've provided almost 18,000 services to LGBTQ survivors. So that might include advocacy services, such as going to court with folks, or counseling services, housing services, financial services, support groups. There's a lot of different things that these agencies provide to survivors. And so that's a lot. So we're really proud of that. And lastly, over 7,000 people have been reached via our training, technical assistance, and outreach efforts. All right, so with that, we are going to transition to our panel. And I'll stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Stacy Sechrist, who's going to be our moderator for the rest of the session.
Thank you, Kate. That was an awesome overview, and thank you for getting us started. And welcome to all of our attendees. We're really excited to be able to bring this symposium to you. My name is Stacy Sechrist. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm one of the project co-directors along with Paige Smith of the NC LGBTQ Domestic Violence Initiative. And the initiative is housed in the Public Health Education Department at UNC Greensboro. And I'm very excited to be here to moderate and to learn from our expert panel of LGBTQ advocates who've been working tirelessly in their home agencies to advance the capacity of those agencies to better serve LGBTQ survivors. So if anyone in the audience has any specific questions, please feel free to put them in the question and answer box or the chat box, and we will be looking for those. And just to start out with, I'll toss out a couple of questions. So one of the questions for the panelists: what are some of the unique needs of LGBTQ survivors in your communities that weren't mentioned already? And maybe we'll start with Stephen and then let E respond, and then Kate, and then we'll move along.
Some of the needs that I have come across is safe shelters. Our agency does have 2 shelters that are inclusive, but I think that something that I'm coming across time and time again are shelters that are specifically catered to work with the queer community. That has been something that has been very hard for a lot of individuals that I've served.
I definitely agree. I think one of the primary focuses that everyone will see in this conference is the need for housing and strategic housing. So definitely echoing that need. One of the different dynamics that is not exclusive to LGBTQ survivors, but is definitely more commonplace, is polyamorous relationships. Often folks who are in polyamorous relationships, or who identify as being polyam, or even if they're non-practicing, is just to be considered in having multiple partners, and for that to look very dynamically and to look different for every couple and every individual. And oftentimes when we are dealing with abuse in one relationship, that can affect the different relationships. And so when we come across an individual who is perhaps has multiple partners and they're experiencing abuse in one aspect of their relationships, it can affect different parts of their lives. We also see the need and the attention being brought to dynamic families and families that don't look like your typical nuclear family. And so it's really important to consider all the different ways in which our identities can be queer, and to consider a person as a whole, instead of just, this is just affecting this one relationship that is abusive and toxic. And I think so many times when we think about relationships, we see them very narrow-mindedly, we see them one way. And oftentimes it is not so simple. And I think one of the privileges of being a queer advocate, working with queer folks, is seeing the beauty and seeing the additional hardship that comes with holding multiple identities at one time.
Yeah, so I'll be offering a campus perspective today. So prior to my current role with the project, I served as one of the advocates in the Campus Violence Response Center here at UNCG. And so in my time working with queer survivors, one of the things I saw, and particularly these are, we're thinking about traditionally aged college students. They may also not have a safe home environment. So their parents might be not supportive of their queer or trans identity. And, that's its own form of abuse. But if they're also, trying to potentially escape, abusive, intimate partnership or dating relationship, and maybe their parents don't financially support them, or they don't have another safe space to go, that's an issue that came up a lot. And of course, that's not just with students too, right? Like, I think having financial stability is something we see a lot with queer and trans folks. And of course, that's even amplified if they have other marginalized identities as well. So that is something I ran into. Of course, there are other examples, but I'll hold off for now.
Great. Thanks, everyone, for your perspectives. One thing
Can I add, Stacy, as well?
Absolutely.
Sorry. Another thought I have is that I don't know if this is a universal experience. I can have my suspicions, but especially here in the Triangle in North Carolina, our queer community is often very small and very close-knit. And we have the unique challenge of kind of everybody has at least heard of everybody. And oftentimes the small community can be a blessing and a challenge. And in terms of the organizations that also help specifically like queer and trans folks, there can be a lot of overlap, and that can create a lot of complications within the community. And then I want to also just echo again what Kate said, is that family violence is not exclusive to students. And oftentimes here we are in the pandemic, there's more folks living at home with each other. Family violence is a big contributing factor to a lot of the services that we provide. So I would say that that is a pretty universal challenge as well. Thank you.
Thank you, E. So we have a question in the chat box, which relates really nicely to another of the questions that I had for you all. So you all, as the advocates and the specialists in your agencies, have really been taking the lead on making this organizational and agency change to build the capacity of that agency to serve LGBTQ survivors better. So could you all talk a little bit about some of the specific ways that you've helped build capacity? And then I think this question is related. So does your organization have intake personnel who are LGBTQ or identify, who are publicly out, that could assist any person who walks in and needs services? So maybe again, we'll go in the same order. So Stephen, and then E, and then Kate, if that's okay.
Okay. Our organization setup is kind of unique because we're within a family justice center model. However, when individuals do come into the Family Justice Center, if they do identify as part of the community, they will be directly referred to me if their needs are specific to the needs of our community. In regards to capacity, over the past few months, I have actually been stepping kind of outside of my role, doing some coverage in some other areas, but that has been kind of a good thing because it's allowed me to work alongside of all of our advocates. So I'm literally right there beside them and doing training with them throughout the day. Also, I've started back in January, we send out a monthly activity guide, and we cover various topics such as pronouns or how to be an ally to someone who needs or wants to come out. So I think that the best experience though is me being alongside of our advocates and working with them. So I'm available in the centers as individuals come in, they can pull me in if needed, if it's something specific to our community.
So I have the privilege of working at the LGBTQ Center of Durham. And we are very proud that we are identity forward in everyone that everyone that works at the center. So we all have the privilege of just assuming that, we all are queer, gender nonconforming, trans, and that is what makes our center so unique and so beautiful. And so it is a safe assumption that if folks are coming to us and seeking help, that they fall somewhere in that category. Of course, we don't make assumptions about anyone's identity until they tell us who they are. But it is a privilege that when folks come to us, they know that they are talking to someone who holds hopefully some shared identity. And it is always a best practice for me when I talk to folks. It's more than just asking pronouns. It's more than just, talking about their gender or sexual identity, but whether or not this information is safe to share with others is a really key component, because oftentimes, well, not oftentimes, but I have seen that when folks do come and seek help, they're not always out to even their partner with whom they're experiencing violence with. And so it is always important to know the context of, like, are you out to this person? Is this safe to disclose? Is this, vital to know? And when then we work on referral process, it's important that the client and the person that we're working with always leads in determining, what information is shared with whom and how much of this is vital to you getting help. So it's always really important to consider all of those different factors. It's a little bit more than just knowing your names and who knows your name and who this is your preferred name, who can, I call you this in front of, and establishing that level of safety with clients too. So there's lots to consider there.
Thinking about building organizational capacity, I do want to say, I think E and Stephen did not brag on themselves enough, because these are two of our specialists who have done incredible work over the past year plus in, training their organizations or other community partners in starting to create support groups or co-facilitate support groups for queer and trans folks. So many different things that they have impressed me with. So I just wanted to highlight that. I think, so some of the things that I have done at UNCG that have been important or helpful, I think, is I used to offer a training, like an LGBTQ survivor support sort of training, to any faculty and staff at the university that wanted to attend. Because the model of this project is we don't just want people within the domestic violence agencies to be able to better respond to queer and trans survivors, but you also have all these other partners in the picture, whether that is other shelters and community, the court system, local LGBTQ organizations. Like there's so many different partners. At a university, there's housing, there's counseling services, deans of students, all these different partners. And so it benefits queer folks or everyone to have an understanding of these issues. And so the more training and education that can be offered, that's a great way to kind of just improve that community care model. Yeah.
Thanks, Kate. We're getting some really interesting questions in the Q&A box, so we'll try our best to get through these while we have time. So one of our questions is, how can one best serve a person who is struggling with their identity? I am not queer and want to ensure that I am not harming someone. So would anyone like to volunteer to take that question first?
Yeah, great question, Jasmine. I would advise that in your practice and how you speak with people, and even how you speak about issues, to be mindful of if you are gendering your language. It's really easy to assume that an abuser can be cis male and say he, or to even the ways in which you assume families or family roles or individual roles, to make the assumption that you're working with a cis, hetero, straight person. And so for everyone, like I would advise to examine and scrutinize even language on forms or the questions you ask at intake to say like, are these being seen through this hetero cis normative lens? And the best way to do that is to get queer people to look at it and to have folks who hold these identities and ask them and to actually let them lead. It's really important that folks in your agency do not become tokenized and are not just used as a diversity placement. This is true of race, this is true of gender and sexual identity, but to make sure it is actually centered and focused. So for folks in leadership, this is a call to you to hire queer people and to make it a priority, because it's a straight world out there. And so one of the best ways that you can even just begin unpacking your cis hetero norms is to examine the language that you use and maybe the biases that you already have about the world. But I'll pass it to somebody else.
I would agree with that at 100%. And I think another way to support is something, the first question I always ask anybody is, what do you want? What do you want? How can I help you? To kind of get their perspective with what they're wanting. And then, but what I will say is I've spent probably the past couple of months working with someone on our staff. We have revamped an entire curriculum that was gendered and have completely redid the model of how it looks. And it's something that the agency's been using for years. And I think that the gendering language, but also just asking like, how can I help you? How can I support you?
Yeah, I think E and Stephen hit on the biggest things. I mean, it's often really simple, I think. Like people get so caught up in the language and the terminology that should be used, which is super important, but it's not everything, right? Like I think inviting people in and making space for queer and trans people just to show up as their authentic selves, you know, using your empathy skills and your vulnerability is really important in like starting those conversations. And I had another thought and I lost it. But yeah, no, they said good stuff already, so.
Thanks, Shaw. So another question from our attendees, if you haven't spoken to it already, would you be able to speak to capacity building that you may have had to do for serving other LGBTQ people, even as LGBTQ people and advocates? Does anyone have anything they would like to add to that?
I will say that in terms of building competency and helping everybody in your organization to be able to be competent in working with queer and trans folks is to, like I mentioned earlier, do not tokenize your out LGBTQ folks in your agency and do not place all the burden on them to lead the charge for inclusivity. I think it's really important that folks move beyond the LGBTQ 101 training that we have all adapted to. We need to start having less conversations about what pronouns are and just start using them, and also to enhance our education. One of the things when we were planning this was we do not want to focus very long on what it means to be LGBTQ, because the time is now, and we're over that. And it's really important to not be the only, folks on your team, in your leadership, in your coworkers that are the only ones advocating for the LGBTQ inclusivity. And yeah, all that burden shouldn't be placed on just one or two people. And yeah, to be mindful of who is doing that and why aren't other people, and to really question those things. So that's one piece of advice, I guess, or one little nugget that I have. Pass it on.
I don't know if this is answering the question, but the question makes me think about, like, you know, us and other people who are queer, you know, serving other queer folks. It's a blessing and a joy, but it's also incredibly emotionally challenging at times, right? So I think just like learning the importance of self-care and self-love, especially in this type of work, is of huge importance. But yeah, other than that, I don't have anything for this question.
And I don't have anything to add. I would echo what E said, though, just making sure that it's not one person who's charged with doing all the work, because it is very, very difficult. And so I think that the more people that we can have in our corner to help support what we're trying to do, the better.
Great. Thank you all for your input on that question. Our next question asks, what has it been like to seek partnership with other domestic violence or sexual assault organizations in your region in order to serve your clients as advocates?
For me, that's actually been very easy. I'm doing quite a few partnerships with some of the other locations. I'm doing some partnerships with our LGBTQ center. So I've not had any kind of pushback or anything like that. It's been more of just a collaborative where we're all learning and sharing space to help the community.
I will say that I am fiercely protective of who I refer clients to. And partnership with us as the center is a privilege. So I will start with that caveat. We are very careful with who we consider to be partners at the center. And that is because we listen to our community. It is very important for us to hear the feedback of the folks who have already interacted with community, other helping organizations, and to listen to what they say and who they've talked to and what and how they have been received elsewhere. And there are, I would say we probably have two different kinds, and this is not exclusive, but there's kind of two ways of thinking about partnership, at least with us. We have the privilege of being an identity-centered organization. And so we may have a little bit more flexibility than some DVSA places, but in that we get to pick and choose who we want to refer to. And like I said, that is based on community feedback. And if a client comes to us and says, you know, I went here, but they weren't really helpful, and they also misgendered me a few times and blah, 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 like that's a really good indicator that this agency probably needs more help, more education, and feedback for them to know what's happening. But to be able to trust an organization to say, yes, we actively refer here, we can recommend these people, I would say is a privilege. It also creates a very small and narrow world of partnership, which is really hard. And so at the same time, we like to come to these organizations and say like, hey, we have suggestions for how you can improve these services, for how you can talk and work with your clients. And it's really, the onus is on them if they want to partner with us in creating a better, safer world for all of our folks. So yeah.
Yes, I love all of what you just said. I have nothing to add.
Great. Next question we have is from a victim advocate who works at an agency within Family Justice Center. and they still predominantly facilitate domestic violence protective order filings at their office. So how have you all built up your capacity for navigating the very binary cishet world of the justice system? Loaded question, but a good one.
I'm not going to lie. That has been because we work within a family justice center model, and it's been very, very difficult. I think probably over the past couple months, honestly, I'm getting a lot more questions from some of our partners, doing trainings with our partners, with the police department, with legal aid, just doing a lot of outreach within the Family Justice Center model. It has been difficult. And it, especially when we are, once that the 50B has, or 50C has been filed, we do not have any control over what's happening on the other end with the judicial system. So that's very difficult. And then having the opportunity to get in front of them, to talk to them is very difficult, very, very difficult, if even at all possible. So I think I think again, with me being in the family justice centers here for the past since July, it has helped because I am getting more questions. I'm getting pulled in, and I'm being able to monitor what staff are doing to make corrections along the way. But it's I'm not going to lie, it's been very difficult, and I wish I could answer that a little bit differently, but that's the way it's been for me.
This is our, I feel like one of the biggest struggles is dealing with the system, quotation marks on the system. And this is very real. I mean, correct me somebody if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't until 2020 that in North Carolina, DVPO language was open to queer relationships as well. Was that correct?
This year, 2021.
This year, 2021, here we are. So, progress is real slow. We're about 2 or 3 decades behind. And I try to do as much advocating up front as I can. If I make a referral, let's say I'm working with a court advocate or a legal aid, somebody. And although most of the time there's confidentiality, once you move past release work, what I tend to do is, or will do, have done, et cetera, what I recommend is kind of advocating for a person's identity. When we go to court, we have to paint a picture with our DVPO filing of what is happening in the relationship and the nature of the relationship. And what I advise clients to do is to paint that picture as much as they can. When you get to write the little paragraph describing what's happening, maybe even just saying like, I am in a queer relationship. Most judges don't know what queer means or think it's still a slur. So working against that kind of thing. And just helping the judge to understand, because I've seen cases where the judge assumes a person is straight until both of them are standing there and still are really ignorant, and they gal pal them, they still assume incorrectly about the relationship. So sometimes it's can be helpful to advocate ahead of time and say, just to let you know, this is what we're coming with. This person uses they, them pronouns. This person identifies as non-binary, if you have the client's permission to disclose that. And trying to kind of get there ahead of time in whatever way that you can. That I will just say that this is one of the challenges. And so educating and giving opportunity to even talk with legal aid and help educate clerk of courts and help educate judges, officers, whoever, even if it's just folks who work at the front desk and admin level at the courthouse, like offering education to them and then offering advocacy on the upfront. I know that's kind of a little vague. Obviously, it varies case by case, but I will just say like that is some of the biggest barriers that I feel like can be faced in this work.
Yeah, since I'm no longer in a direct service role, I want E and Stephen to answer these types of questions. So yeah, the only thing I'll add, which, both of them said or alluded to, is like those systems were not built for us. Like they were not built for marginalized communities, for queer relationships. So, I mean, just when you're working with victims and survivors, make sure they know all of their options, and that a lot of times, seeking a protective order might not be the best option for them, or going through the court system. Oftentimes it probably is not the option that they want unless they're in a really dangerous relationship, but it varies so much. So just, especially if no matter how you identify as a service provider, having the knowledge to like talk with your clients and, maybe explaining some of these challenges that E mentioned up front of like, this is what the system is like, this is potentially what you have to go through, and just, help them feel empowered to make the best decision. Yeah.
Great, thanks, y'all. So we've got one more question in the Q&A session, and then I wanted to couple that because we're running low on time. Just kind of because we talked a lot about challenges, but maybe if you all have some advice for other advocates or leaders or just folks in the community, be they professionals or otherwise, who want to queer their anti-violence work. So one, if you could just speak briefly to do you offer refresher trainings for new employees as language and laws change? And then secondly, if you could end us with a piece of advice for others who want to go out into their own communities and queer their anti-violence work.
I think with the trainings that I have done and some of the activities that I've done within the agency, it's constantly ongoing. And we also store all of our trainings and activity guides on a shared drive where they're very much accessible to everyone. We are currently trying to set up systems within our agency where it's part of the onboarding. I know within our victim services division, we do have a lot of crossover where I'm not just responsible for the outreach team anymore. I'm also supporting the victim advocates and the FJCs. And so I think my reach in regards to training individuals has been helpful in doing so. And then Stacy, you said what advice?
Yes, any advice that you may have for other people who want to go out into their community, be they professionals or otherwise, and queer their anti-violence work?
I would just say ask questions. I think and be gracious. I think that's also important because we are working with individuals who have all different kinds of levels of knowledge and experience, and being able to just ask what questions you need. There's someone out there that definitely would know how to answer it for you.
Sorry, y'all, I was typing some thoughts because I did not want to lose this train of thought. In terms of training, I love the idea that you are seeking more knowledge and want to know more information. I would put the pressure on your supervisor, your manager, whoever are in charge of deciding trainings, and not only ask for more trainings, but be specific if you can, be vulnerable in what kind of training you need. Because like I said, it is time to move away from the LGBTQ 101. We are done. We should be there. The bar is in hell, y'all. It is time to step up what you demand for your education, okay? So when you express the need for training, be specific. You say, like, I am still struggling with working with trans folks. Okay, why? Maybe that's something you need to talk out with somebody who is not gay. Do not put that burden on them. Talk to your cis friends and advocate for yourself and where you feel like you still struggle. If you're still unlearning homophobia and transphobia, that's okay. Continue the fight, please. People's lives are at stake. And so when you do ask for training, also make sure you are paying these folks. Whether they're inside or outside, y'all, being gay is expensive. Enough said. And we deserve pay, especially if they're folks of color. You better be paying those people. Secondly, I will say is to be specific with your need, because if you are struggling with how to deal with X, Y, and Z, like, it's important to be specific in getting that kind of help. Otherwise, you're just putting a blanket over something, or you're just band-aiding a problem. So in terms of advice for agencies and moving forward, I would definitely also think about the ways in which we approach justice. Stephen and Kate have already mentioned this, but queering your approach to justice and approach to problem solving is very important. As like a abolitionist, as somebody that tries to advise away from cops, because we realize that is oftentimes a point of trauma and danger for most of our folks. I do a lot of problem solving and talking about how to help survivors that do not rely on the systems that already fail them. And so that often looks like talking about beyond policing, talking about community help. And so pay attention to those smaller orgs that maybe don't get all of the money or don't get all of the spotlight already. Who is out there doing abolitionist work, who are moving away from policing, who rely on community trust and partnership to help your clients? Is there a group that, will stand in the room so that a cop doesn't have to, so that your client can get their belongings out of their abuser's house? Is there other community alternatives to this work that we do not have to rely on the same system that is already traumatizing them? Oftentimes my clients will just say it is too traumatizing to go through this process again, or it is, I would rather not re-traumatize myself. And I also tell that to clients, I don't want to re-traumatize you. Let's think of an alternative to a no contact order, because the process in itself is traumatizing. Like, this is where we are. There needs to be a huge reckoning within our state and within the way that we do things. So be a voice in your community, be an advocate in your community for methods that are not traditional, to methods to problem solving and accountability that are not traditional. One of the ongoing conversations I feel like I have with trusted partners and coworkers is, what does it mean to have accountability within the queer community? Because like I said, we are often very close knit. And so that means identities and relationships tend to overlap in multiple levels. And so again, not taking a single dynamic approach to problem solving and to creating peace and harmony within a community. So that's a mouthful. That's where I have. Let's see, someone said, yes, Durham Beyond Policing. Thank you, Jamelia. Yes.
Yeah, that resource sounds awesome. So yeah, this, if you haven't figured it out already, this work is hard, right? This work is really challenging and takes time. And so if you are an organization or a leader or activist or whatever, just kind of make sure you have like the time and commitment, the people, the resources kind of in place to help advance this work, right? And I think a really like advice that I would, one piece of advice I want to uplift is like have queer and trans folks of color at the table and leadership roles guiding this work. And clearly like in our group right now, this is an area where we're lacking. All of the specialists are currently white, and this project in the past year has really been trying to uplift racial equity work and intersectionality alongside the LGBTQ work, and that, we're not going to get anywhere unless we do that. And we really prioritize, Black, Indigenous, and other folks of color within queer communities. So that is the advice that I would give.
Thank you, everyone. And so we're at time, but I just want to extend a huge thanks to our panelists for sharing their expertise and knowledge with us. It's been a pleasure having all of you work as part of the initiative. And again, just thank you for your time and for sharing your knowledge.
Thanks, audience, for your great questions.
I will also add that we are going to be having some really great breakout groups later today. And so more of these questions and community ideas and resource sharing, I would love to talk with y'all more in some of those breakout groups in our discussion groups.